Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to update those that are familiar with Cardiol, and for those that are new to the story, tell you about the great work we're doing in cardiac inflammation. Importantly, the team at Cardiol has worked in heart failure medicine for over 30 years, and the genesis of this new venture is based on a discovery that was made at the National Institute of Health, a very important discovery, that basically demonstrated the ability of cannabidiol, a molecule you're probably more familiar with as being called CBD, if dosed right in a pure form, could reverse fibrosis and inflammation in a model of heart failure. This is important because this model was a diabetic heart failure model. 60% of heart failure patients approximately have diabetes in their background. And we were fascinated by this observation because we believe this may be a new approach to diastolic heart failure, which remains a leading cause of death and disability in the developed world. And one of the most significant reasons people are frequently hospitalized, which drives healthcare costs of extraordinary levels at $30 billion annually. So we have now developed an international leadership team, steering committees, research network, to develop this important new area of medicine targeting areas of heart failure medicine and inflammatory heart disease. This is based on a strong scientific rationale. We now have advanced clinical programs. In fact, we have two INDs cleared by the FDA to execute trials in high-risk cardiac patients. We have a strong research pipeline focused on new formulations of this important area of medicine that can more efficiently deliver the drug to concentrate at sites of inflammation in the cardiovascular system. And we've developed a comprehensive intellectual property portfolio to protect our assets and all the discoveries we're making here at Cardiol in the area of heart failure medicine. Our lead formulation is a pure pharmaceutically produced cannabidiol solution. This allows us to maximize dosing with a stable formulation that is consistent and reproducible, that is manufactured to the highest standards of all pharmaceuticals worldwide. So this medicine can be made available affordably, reproducibly, and consistently. And it is this oral formulation, which is our lead drug candidate, that is the subject of two clinical programs in cardiac inflammation, the most significant of which is a group of high-risk cardiovascular patients who are at particularly high risk for mortality or cardiovascular complications, because on top of the cardiovascular risk profile, they become COVID positive and are hospitalized for that case. We know these patients are at a significantly elevated risk for suffering major cardiovascular complications and/or death. We also have an important IND just cleared in acute myocarditis, which is a devastating form of heart muscle inflammation and represents a leading cause of sudden cardiac death in children and young, otherwise healthy adults. And then we have an innovative program developing a new formulation to better target this medicine, or smart target it towards cardiac inflammation in a higher concentration, so we can deal with the chronic inflammatory fibrotic damage to heart muscle that underlies major medical problems such as diastolic heart failure or heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, which affects about 55% of all heart failure patients. And that is a very large market affecting 26 million people in the developed world. Our interest in this molecule now stems from our research, as well as the widely published research in the literature today concerning the ability of this molecule to reduce inflammation in the systemic vascular system, to reduce important markers of inflammation, such as those you may have heard of involved in the cytokine storm, such as IL-6 or TNF. These are very important inflammatory mediators that when they're elevated, that is a sign of risk. Troponin T is a marker of cardiac injury that cannabidiol has beneficially modulated. It's also improved cardiac function, and some of the more recent data that we've had accepted for presentation at the American College sessions in 2020 was data demonstrating the ability of the molecule to ameliorate or reverse the progression of fibrosis, which is really the process by which heart muscle tissue starts to die. On the basis of all of these compelling observations surrounding the ability of this molecule to influence cardiac inflammation, we assembled a steering committee comprising thought leaders from around the world, comprising the head of the Charité in Berlin, which is one of the largest myocarditis practices in all of Europe. The chair and co-chair of this panel have representation from the Mayo Clinic, University of Pittsburgh Cardiac Transplantation. And this involves heart failure specialists from other major tertiary referral centers, including Ottawa Heart Institute, Cleveland Clinic, DeBakey Heart Center, and others. And it is this independent panel of thought leaders in cardiac inflammation and heart failure medicine that designed our most significant clinical program to date, which is the Lancer trial. This is a phase 2/3 trial sanctioned under an IND by the FDA that is now international. We have clinical infrastructure now in place in the US, Brazil, Mexico, and potentially we'll be extending it to Canada as well. And here we're studying, importantly, cardiac inflammation in a high-risk patient population who becomes COVID positive, because that sets up for this extraordinary level of complication or mortality risk in these patient populations. As illustrated in the JAMA Cardiology publication, here we see patients, and this is with the Alpha variant, and we know the Delta variant is actually more virulent and more contagious, but even with respect to the Alpha variant, here we see patients with a prior history of cardiac injury. They have about a 50% mortality out 25 days to the extent that they develop or are infected with the COVID virus on top of that background cardiovascular risk profile. This is a Kaplan-Meier curve. Each step down on that curve represents increasing mortality because the y-axis is percent survival and the x-axis obviously is time measured in days. But if you compare it to patients without prior cardiovascular injury or cardiovascular risk factors, you'll see that survival rates exceed 98%. So it's incumbent upon, I think, the pharmaceutical industry to develop new treatments, particularly targeted at this population that in the care pathway present in the hospital. They have a cardiovascular risk profile. They are probably non-responsive to the earlier interventions such as antiviral therapies or monoclonals, and they need a treatment to provide a preconditioning or a cardioprotective benefit to prevent progression to significant adverse side effects or significant complications, or potentially like the ICU and or death. The study is designed to randomize 422 patients at centers throughout the United States, Mexico, Brazil, and potentially Canada. The primary endpoints here, we're looking at risk of one of mortality, progression to ICU, or one of the major cardiovascular complications such as heart attack or stroke. We will dose patients relatively high. We'll dose them up to 15 mg per kilo. So for each kilogram of body weight, they'll receive up to 15 milligrams of drug. So if a patient is 70 kilos, for example, they're dosing up to about 1,000 milligrams a day, which is relatively high compared to typical dosing for this form of medicine. So we want to get drug on board quickly in the 28 days to provide a cardioprotective benefit to these patients with a view to preventing major complications and reducing mortality risk. This just represents the clinical trial design in a more visual way. Patients are randomized on a 1-to-1 basis, so half will receive placebo, half will receive active treatment. They will have the primary endpoint measured at 28 days, and they'll also have a 60-day follow-up. We expect this trial will complete its randomization in Q1, possibly early Q2, and then report data in the first half of 2022. Running in parallel with this program is also a very significant effort and an important program in acute myocarditis. This represents Cardiol's first effort in a cardiac orphan indication. Orphan indications are the FDA and other regulators around the world typically incentivize pharmaceutical companies to speed the development of new important treatments for rare diseases by providing a potentially accelerated pathway, but more importantly, from an economics point of view, a 7 to 10 year monopoly, depending on the region, once the drug is approved, because that pharmaceutical company has gone to great lengths to innovate and develop new treatments for rare disease. In the case of myocarditis, this is a devastating form of heart inflammation. It is a leading cause of sudden cardiac death in children. It can lead to cardiomyopathy, fulminant heart failure, in an otherwise young and otherwise healthy population without the typical historical risk factors. It's typically caused by a viral infection. So you can think of the flu virus, for example. It's also been described as a complication secondary to the COVID virus. It's a rare complication now of mRNA vaccine strategies, as well as certain chemotherapeutic agents used in oncology setting. Severe cases can lead to lengthy ICU and necessitate cardiac transplantation or death in these patients. When we look at the prevalence of this indication, importantly, some of you may be familiar with the first cannabidiol-based medicine was approved through the orphan drug or approved as an orphan drug indication in the rare epilepsies in conditions that have a prevalence of about 36,000. So to put that in relative terms, the prevalence of myocarditis is about twice the size of the market that organization developed a $7 billion value proposition around, as that was the price they were acquired for earlier this year. With respect to orphan drug indications, any indication is typically eligible for orphan drug designation if it affects less than 200,000 Americans at any one time, which clearly myocarditis does. But now with superior forms of diagnosis and better diagnostic materials or tools such as MRI, we may be diagnosing more cases. So the caseload may increase, but we certainly don't see it going outside of the orphan category. And our major interest in this orphan indication, which has equal, certainly devastating mortality and morbidity associated with it, is the impact of cannabidiol in terms of providing a cardioprotection or a preconditioning of cardiac tissue effect in a classical model of autoimmune myocarditis. On the left here, you see normal cardiac tissue, that left yellow panel. In the center, the red regions is scarring, so fibrotic tissue, regions of the heart becoming scarred due to the fibrotic cell death process in the heart. And then on the right, you can see that substantially the majority of the tissue is protected with concomitant treatment with cannabidiol. We believe this is a signal that this is an entirely new way to provide cardioprotection to this high-risk population. And we've just received IND clearance for our second significant clinical effort in this orphan indication. This trial is designed, again, internationally to enroll 100 patients at 25 to 30 sites in the United States, Canada, and major countries of Europe. Here we're measuring major improvements in myocardial recovery using highly precise measurement tools, which is CMR or MRI or magnetic resonant imaging, where we can precisely measure improvements in cardiac performance or ejection fraction, reduction in extracellular volumes, and change in longitudinal strain. These are recognized measures of diagnosing and monitoring improvements or deterioration in this indication. Secondary endpoints are safety, cardiac function, and improvements in quality of life. And similar to the Lancer trial, we are dosing relatively high. We have a longer titration period here of 90 days. We'll be treating over 90 days. So we believe we'll be moving patients up to 20 mg per kilo at max dose here. And the primary endpoints will be observed at 12 weeks post initiation of treatment. We expect to have this trial up and running and randomizing patients in the first half of 2022. And then running in parallel with these important programs in acute inflammatory conditions in the heart failure state with the oral therapeutic, we're developing a very innovative new way to treat patients with chronic disease, which is the sub-Q formulation of the cannabidiol molecule. And we believe this will be addressable to the vast market of heart failure, which by any measure is a devastating medical problem. It affects 6 million people at any one time in Canada, the United States, 26 million people in the developed world. It's driven by forces such as diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure. All those factors are rising in the developed world, unfortunately. Half of patients have diastolic heart failure, where the filling chamber of the heart becomes dysfunctional due to fibrosis. It doesn't relax properly. That's an area of particular interest to advance new treatments for. That's really our focus here. Mortality rates in these patients are extraordinary, at 30% within a year, 50% within 5 years, and it represents a leading cause of hospital admissions, costing the US healthcare system alone approximately $30 billion annually. As mentioned, our particular area of focus is diastolic, where you get a ventricle muscle thickening due to fibrosis and inflammation, it is believed, which limits the ability of the heart to relax and fill properly. So in simplistic terms, the pump does not have sufficient blood to meet metabolic demand, or oxygenated blood to meet metabolic demand. Patients suffer a devastating impact on quality of life. They become exercise intolerant, fluid builds up in the lungs, and they're frequently hospitalized for diuretics and other interventions. We worked with a leading group, world-renowned for heart failure medicine, the DeBakey Heart Transplant Center, the home of the first heart transplant ever performed in the United States, in collaboration with TechSalou, which is international private research sector. We have this international collaboration that has now developed what we believe to be the most advanced way to deliver this medicine in a chronic disease setting. This is a subcutaneous formulation. We've created a formulation that has a viscosity similar to water to allow it to be administered sub-Q, like insulin or intravenously. We believe this will be an auto-injected medication. It'll be required probably once, twice weekly by patients. And the first evidence, or the first signal of the efficiency of this way to deliver the medicine, was observed in these data that were accepted for presentation and published in the American College Journal, or the abstract was published in the American College Journal, American College of Cardiology in March of 2020. Importantly, this is in a model of non-ischemic heart failure, basically, that is induced by hypertension. So angiotensin is infused, which causes systemic hypertension. The hearts work against that vascular resistance and become enlarged and fibrotic, very similar to what happens in the human setting. And as in the human setting, BNP is elevated, which is a marker of cardiac stretch. When it is elevated, it's typically evidence of a state of heart failure. And here we see a downregulation of BNP both at the 10 mg per kilo dose, which is the FDA-approved maintenance dose in the epilepsy setting. But more importantly, we also saw a downregulation significantly with 1/10 of that dose, or 1 mg per kilo. We also made this observation, importantly, in the pathological process, or the disease process. On the left here, you see normal cardiac tissue. One panel in, you see the bluish staining, which is the angiotensin-induced fibrosis setting in. Those are regions of the heart becoming scarred or dying. And one panel over at 10 mg per kilo, that fibrotic lesion or that fibrotic process is ameliorated, both at the 10 mg per kilo, but again, importantly, at 1/10 of that dose. So we have an observation that at a very efficient dosing level, so with less drug, because we're targeting more specifically or more efficiently to sites of inflammation, we can achieve a therapeutic impact on a disease process or a pathological process more effectively with less drug, which is important. So the major accomplishments that this organization has achieved today, which we're very proud of, we completed one of the largest phase 1 trials ever conducted in adults. Understand that the majority of clinical development prior to Cardiol's involvement was conducted in children, because the medicine was first developed for the rare pediatric epilepsies. We conducted a study in 52 adults ranging age 23 to 60. We dosed patients relatively high at 30 mg per kilo, twice or 30% higher than we're dosing in our highest doses in our clinical trials. And even at those dosing levels, we didn't see any laboratory changes of concern, no changes in their electrophysiology or heart status. So we were very pleased with the safety profile of this drug, which has now been confirmed in our studies as well as clinical practice in the pediatric setting over many years now. We initiated one of the largest trials ever to be conducted with this form of medicine, which is the Lancer trial. This is a phase 2/3 trial sanctioned by the FDA and other regulatory agencies, internationally speaking. This trial is designed to enroll and is in the process of enrolling 422 patients, and will be a major clinical result for Cardiol in the coming year. We received FDA clearance for a second important program in cardiac medicine, of cardiac inflammation, which is myocarditis, which unfortunately currently does not have a recognized standard of care. I think that's important. It is a leading cause of sudden cardiac death in children, and there's no recognized standard of care for this heart muscle inflammation. We appointed very significant cardiovascular expertise to both the board as well as the management team. I'll describe the backgrounds of those individuals on the next slide. Importantly, we uplisted to the NASDAQ, so we are now featured on the premier exchange for life sciences companies on a global basis. And we received over 100 million in proceeds from essentially 3 very successful financing initiatives comprising a warrant exercise, a bought deal, and a recent $50 million US offering led by very significant US investment banks in the States, which will now lead to our first US research coverage, which will ultimately help to broaden the awareness and profile of this organization. Importantly, the major efforts now that we're very well capitalized, financed well over the next 3.5 years, we will be reporting a major landmark study, the Lancer trial. We'll be initiating a very important initiative in an orphan indication in cardiac medicine, which is really the trailblazer regulatory schematic by which Cannabidiol was initially developed. And that organization developed a $7 billion valuation. But more importantly, we believe more analogous to our experience was a case for another cardiac orphan where MyoKardia started, and that organization 3.5 years after the major initiatives were started was acquired by Big Pharma for $13 billion. So we believe there's a significant opportunity in the orphan indications as well as the mass market indications to develop a highly valuable enterprise here to allow this organization to drive forward and innovate in cardiac medicine. We're now advancing a subcutaneous formulation, which we believe is a transformative way or offers the potential for a transformative way to treat one of the leading causes of death and disability in the Western world, where we still see rising mortality rates, we still see rising prevalence and incident rates because of the driving forces of diabetes, hypertension, and obesity in the developed world. And we're advancing very important discovery research focused on new anti-inflammatory strategies that are complementary to our lead programs. Our management team comprises expertise over 30 years in developing important new therapeutics. The most recent addition to the team, as previously mentioned, is Dr. Andrew Hammer, who joined us earlier this year from a very distinguished career comprising 6 years with the largest biotechnology company in the world, Amgen, where he headed the Repatha program and the cardiometabolic program, a very important cardiometabolic program on a global basis for that organization. Importantly, prior to that, over 20 years in clinical trial execution, specifically in heart failure, practicing cardiology, heart failure specialist, bringing this unique and rare combination of skill set of state-of-the-art cardiovascular heart failure medicine practice, clinical trial design and execution, as well as industry. Very distinguished financial officer, extraordinary expertise on the clinical affairs basis, operating expertise in terms of scaling new medicines with over 30 years experience in Bernard Lim, and Ann Tomlin on the regulatory side, 30 years of regulatory affairs experience, taking several important drugs through regulatory bodies around the world. Our board is international, independent, chaired by a world-renowned cardiologist, Dr. Guillermo Torre, who went on to head one of the largest heart transplant programs in the world, who trained under Dr. DeBakey, and now heads a vast private research network. We have a commercialization specialist in Ian Chalmers, pharmacologist, extraordinary expertise in the development of cannabinoids in Colin Stote, who was one of the early employees of GW Pharma, joining that organization in the year 2000, and with that organization for 18 years before he retired. And he was part of the team that developed both Sativex and Epidiolex, the first 2 cannabinoid-based medicines approved by regulators around the world, including the FDA. Peter Picos is a veteran of the pharmaceutical industry. He was the founder of Dalton Pharmaceuticals, our global partner, or significant organic chemistry expertise at this organization. And together with Cardiol's chemistry expertise, we've developed novel formulations, both oral, subcutaneous, and working on new innovations. And our most recent addition to the board, Michael Wilner, bringing extraordinary business expertise, legal acumen, financial expertise to the board. Michael just joined us earlier this third quarter. With respect to our cap structure, well represented by insiders and partners, strong financial position. We reported on November 11th that our cash position was $85.7 million. So we have significant capital resources to execute on all of our major programs well into 2024 over a time course that will see very significant clinical development as well as clinical results that we believe will lead to a significant opportunity both for cardiovascular medicine advancements, but also for shareholders in terms of increasing value and revaluation of this organization as we become more broadly known now that we're listed on the NASDAQ, and we are about to secure additional analyst coverage around this organization. So just to summarize, extraordinary leadership team at this organization with over 30 years experience developing novel therapeutics, a world-class scientific advisory panel and independent steering committee with expertise in heart failure medicine that is second to none, and an international research network and pharmaceutical platform to develop innovative medicines in cardiac disease, both in 22 and well beyond. Strong scientific rationale, which is always important. The basis for this molecule in cardiac inflammation is fundamentally rooted in extensive literature, publications, and scientific discoveries, both in Cardiol's hands as well as independent labs around the world. We have advanced clinical programs up and running, which are studying the impact of this important medicine on cardiac inflammation in high-risk patient populations. We have a strong research pipeline focused on new innovative ways to regulate inflammation, including an important new formulation of the cannabidiol molecule. And all of these assets have been comprehensively protected by a growing intellectual property base. And with that, I'm not sure whether I've gone over time or not, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions if time does permit. I think you're on mute there, Julian.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, David. So thank you very much for the presentation. We have time for a few questions, which we noted and we will be happy to relay to you. So first of all, maybe a few of them will be repeating what you said, but maybe adding a little precision would help the attendees. So first of all, when can we expect the Lancer results?
Our public guidance with respect to the Lancer results is the first half of 2022.
Okay, perfect. And then when you receive those results, is this the definitive results or not?
We certainly expect these results to be very informative to the organization, given that we're studying cardiac inflammation. So this trial is potentially supportive of an emergency use authorization in the context of the pandemic, which I believe, I think everyone watching this call today is aware. It continues to rage in parts of Europe. It's becoming troubling once more in the United States, with caseloads once again rising in what they're now calling the fifth wave as the Northern Hemisphere enters winter. So this is a seasonal virus. It's a coronavirus. Patient population that has cardiovascular background is always going to be the highest risk. And any patient that presents at the hospital has at that point been non-responsive to the earlier onset therapies. And there really isn't a treatment targeting that cardiac high-risk population that enters the hospital. So we see a very unique opportunity to provide a hospital-based medicine to confer cardioprotection. And we will certainly make the case and argue the case for emergency use authorization subject to the outcomes of this trial, which, as mentioned, is, I believe, the largest trial ever conducted with this medicine on a randomized controlled clinical basis.
Perfect. Second question, confirming your financing you just did, 50 million. Was there any US funds, new important investors, or how was the buy-in?
The financing that we just completed, which was led by Canaccord and Cantor in the US, was substantially entirely subscribed for by US institutions. There was a small retail component to it to ensure sufficient distribution, but it was substantially institutionally placed.
Perfect. Following up question, there was a little shakedown on the share price a little after the financing. Could you give us a little insight on your share price movement? What do you guys believe drives it, and maybe a little more details?
Well, primarily I'm a heart failure medicine guy, so I'm not really a share price expert. So, but I would suggest to you that the impact on the share price is paradoxical and really inexplicable. So the company has never been in a stronger position in its history. We have a world-class management team, world-class research network. We're developing world-class medicine for some of the largest medical problems in the world. We're now fully financed for 3.5 years over a course of very significant news milestones that are analogous to those types of development efforts that GW Pharma and Myocardia developed, and both of those organizations at a time frame similar to where we're at, delivering results similar to the results we are about to deliver in 2022 and beyond, were acquired respectively for $7 billion and $13 billion. Meanwhile, our market cap is sub 200 million. So we believe there's a significant disparity between the valuation we should be trading at and the valuation we currently are at. When that is closed, that's ultimately up to the market to decide. But I'd suggest to you that represents an opportunity. But again, I'm a heart failure medicine guy. I have developed heart failure medicines and developed companies around heart failure medicine for 30 years. That will always be my primary focus and the focus of the management team, because that is ultimately which will deliver an organization that is meaningful, valuable, profitable, and can change people's lives in heart failure. And if we do that, I assure you the stock price will look after itself in due course.
Perfect. And maybe last two questions that can be combined in one. The COVID situation is gaining very much speed, very fast in Europe, more specifically Germany, Austria. What are more in details your ties to German hospitals, if you have any, or doctors? We saw in your presentation there is someone there that's important for you guys. And are you recruiting any patients specifically in Germany?
Currently not specifically recruiting patients in Germany, albeit we are interested now that the caseloads, this virus is moving around the world, and it's hard to chase a disease that is migrating into regions on a wave after wave basis. But we do plan to run a very significant clinical program in myocarditis in major countries of Europe. There is the possibility we would extend the Lancer trial to include countries like Germany. I'm not committing to that. I'm not promising that. We are in discussions with regulators currently. We certainly plan to include major trial centers in Germany, such as the Charité in the myocarditis program. But there's also been strong expressions of interest in the Lancer program, given, as you mentioned, the Delta variant is raging now in major countries of Europe, and we have a cardioprotective agent for those patients that are being hospitalized, either because of breakthrough infection or they're vaccine naive or some other combination of risk factor. And that is the opportunity we see. So we are certainly investigating that, exploring that, and that may occur. And to the extent that it does, we will certainly inform you on the research side, as well as all shareholders of that.
Perfect. And lastly, there has been a lot of new research conducted and released lately about COVID, and more specifically heart inflammation on the long term for people that had actually mild COVID symptoms, so maybe didn't even realize they had COVID. And it seems now that there might be actually consequences on their heart, which we didn't know about just a few months ago.
Yes, there's overwhelming evidence of that. So we are seeing changes, structural changes in hearts of patients on MRI 6 months, 12 months after they had confirmed viral infection, even patients that were asymptomatic. So there's no question that this virus invades the cardiorespiratory system, and in a very high percentage of patients leaves damage that could be permanent. We could be setting up for an entirely new generation of cardiomyopathies in patients that don't have the typical risk factors, such as diabetes, obesity, hypertension, smoking. So if you look at those typical risk factors, COVID could be a new one that 5-10 years from now we have a whole new wave of heart failure inflammation or heart inflammation caused by that as a new risk factor, irrespective of the typical risk factors. And that will be a real tragedy. So we all hope the pandemic comes under control as soon as possible, but realistically, I think the world now understands it's endemic. Our chance to eradicate it has passed, and we need to be vigilant in developing new important treatments to protect those patients who become viral positive, and specifically those high-risk patients with these cardiovascular risk factors. And that's certainly more than when you combine all the different risk factors like hypertension, obesity, background in heart failure, for example, that would be over 50% of patients that present in the hospital. So there's a significant patient population that remains vulnerable, and that is where Cardiol looks and is working diligently night and day to play an important role.
Perfect. So David, we exhausted all the questions from the attendees. So I think this presentation is coming to an end. This roundtable, we want to take a minute to thank everyone for joining on behalf of GBC and on behalf of Cardiol Therapeutics. This was very informative. We thank you very much for your time, David, and for the great presentation. We would like, obviously, you to have the closing words, and if you have a last or two little sentence you want to just reinforce a message or thank everyone, would be great.
Certainly. First, Julian, I'll start with a great thanks to you for arranging this and inviting us to this amazing opportunity to present the Cardiol story that we're very proud of. We look forward to 2022 with great enthusiasm, because the organization is now financed better than it ever has been in history. We have a long developmental run rate, 4 years into the future. We have tremendous opportunities to improve people's lives in a disease where mortality and morbidity rates, unfortunately, are not coming down. We plan to change that. We plan to influence that. We believe we have the right team. We have the right international team of network of researchers. We have the certainly extraordinary Cardiol team supporting this. We have the right partners in our great partner with Dalton Pharmaceuticals that is represented on our board, with the CEO serving on our board. So we're well positioned to move our innovations forward. We have advanced clinical programs up and running, and we look forward to a strong news flow to broaden the awareness now that we're NASDAQ listed, now that we've just completed a very important public offering, and with major dominant institutions in the United States. And we look forward to broadening the awareness on the investor relations front going forward, both through new analysts covering the story, as well as the outbound effort on our part, and certainly with the great research that you're providing, Julian, to help build awareness of this story throughout the broad regions that you cover. So a big thanks to you, and a thanks to everyone for continued support. And we look forward to great things to come.
All right, perfect. So thank you for that, David. I think this comes to an end. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and we welcome you to our next presentation. Bye-bye.